You're on.
Good. Thank you very much. And I have not sorted them all out, but what I think I will do is go through these, and I'm sure that there'll be some duplication, and if I find one that has been repeated, we'll put that one aside, having already answered it. So, does not the reason for the Noachian flood, the flood of Noah, seem more reasonable to be the sin of the sons of God coming and seeing the daughters of men rather than of Seth, that whole issue of Seth and Cain? The challenge with Genesis 6, which is why I don't know how to interpret Genesis 6. I think the real challenge, can I come down here? I don't have to wait up here, do I? Am I all right? Except if I don't trip over those cords. The challenge with Genesis 6 is that if you take Seth and Cain, the sons of Seth and the daughters of Cain, that works in terms of the way we are made, and that works physiologically, but it does not work exegetically. And by that I mean that the word sons of God is always used in the Old Testament for some sort of angelic being, some sort of extra, someone non-human. But if you go with the exegesis, if you go in, the sons of God shouted together in the book of Job, shouted together at the creation of the world. Those are angelic beings. If you go with the sons of God as angelic beings, then that doesn't work really well physiologically. So I'm not sure where to go with that. I'm not sure how to understand it. And the only thing I can say is that it is, we can trace very easily what others in Judaism later thought. And so I mentioned some of those references. But the question here is, doesn't it seem like a higher level of problem if angels are crossing lines than for the sons of Seth to marry the daughters of Cain? Probably, well, it certainly was. If in fact that's what's in mind in the text, it's a matter of God's created beings stepping outside of their order. And that translates into hubris or pride or arrogance. And if you're looking for a sin to blame bad things on in the Old Testament, that's the worst of all. It's arrogance. It's claiming to be better than someone else, and it's using that against someone else. You read the hard-hitting prophetic passages. It's against the proud. It's against the mighty. It's against those who claim to be at the top. If you read Isaiah 14 and Ezekiel 30, I think it's 28, I think it is. No, it's not 28. It's slipping my mind right now. Where you read about the morning star that rose and claimed such things. Those are the ones that get hit the hardest. Now, others have asked the question about the flood. We typically refer to Adam and Eve and their time as the time of the great fall. Others would argue that it's really the flood story that's the great fall. And if it is God's creatures stepping outside of their boundaries, then that's something significant to think about. Again, I don't know where you go with a final explanation of that passage. Explain why so many caves in different locations housing the Dead Sea Scrolls. That's a very good question. The Qumran caves seem to represent a place for the storage and protection of these manuscripts. A number of these manuscripts date from before the time of the Qumran community. Qumran community starts about 130 BC. We have manuscripts that go back to about 250 BC. So that means that people were not just producing them, they were collecting them. So they had brought them from other places, probably Jerusalem, when they came out. Maybe they were storage places already when the Qumran community came there, and they simply took over the guardianship of them. And what you try to find is someplace that's safe and that's secure and that will not be immediately observed and thereby entered. And to have them in several places means that you are diversifying. You're not putting all of your wealth in one place, you're spreading it around. I don't know all of the history of the sites down the coast, down the west coast of the Dead Sea. But certainly at Qumran, these were places where they felt they could secure them, they could lock them up, they could put stones over and protect them. And when the Romans were on their way, and they knew it, secure everything. You don't need anything in the community. You want to protect everything. If this community goes, you don't want the manuscripts to go. So it was a Herculean effort, and we are extremely grateful. Whatever sorts of trauma they went through, we are extremely grateful. Do the Dead Sea Scrolls give any hint where the Garden of Eden was located? Not that I'm aware of. There are the suggestions about places further east of Palestine, out in the what is now the Arabian Desert. There are actually ancient actually from satellite photography, you can see tracks that converge at different places. And some have suggested that in ancient times there might be something there, but there's no way to know. And I'm not sure that the Dead Sea Scrolls say anything about them. I'm not aware that they do. Within the Dead Sea Scrolls, is there any light regarding the age of the earth? I don't know about the age of the earth, but there's a lot about the beginning of the earth, including the stories of the giants and the flood and so on. There is one text called dubbed by scholars today, the ages of the earth. And it has to do not with that scientific question, when did things begin? It has to do with how time is divided. And time, according to this text, is divided into 70 weeks of years. Does that sound familiar to anybody? 70 weeks of years. And so the concerns, even, I would argue, even in the Old Testament, especially when you get to the genealogies, the concern is not simply to put one time period, one lifetime on top of another one to extend it for the kinds of questions we have. The time in the Old Testament, I would say, and at the community of Qumran, was to map out how God divided our lives and the lives of the history of the earth, how God did that. For instance, the time from, I think it's from Adam to Abraham. I may have one of those names wrong, but Abraham is one of the figures, is 10 of these 70. And whether those actually match years isn't the question. The question is how the time is equally and consistently and in an orderly way organized. If you go, for instance, to the genealogies of Jesus, the genealogy of Jesus in the book of Matthew, and if you're very careful when you read who's in each of those categories, each of those 14 generations, you'll find out that Matthew is creative. Matthew uses at least one person in two sets of these 14. So what mattered for time management and an understanding of time in the ancient world were the patterns of time. Our question, the age of the earth question, doesn't seem to have been that important. In fact, if you study the genealogies in the Hebrew Bible, the Old Testament, in the Greek Old Testament, the Septuagint, and in another one called the Samaritan Pentateuch, you'll notice that the years vary, but they all are concerned with a pattern. And interestingly, I'm just thinking of this. Thank you, whoever wrote this question. At the center of the patterns of the genealogies is the flood. So this whole business of the Nephilim, the fall, the collapse, all of that is at the center of the way time was understood. Now that's interesting to think about. So what you end up with is that so many years from the flood back that matches a certain event, that matches something, and it's usually the fall of Jerusalem. That was a major event in Jewish history. So it's the patterns. It's not so much the years. So I don't think the Dead Sea Scrolls would tell us much about the age of the earth the way we ask the question. It would tell us about the ages of the earth. That's the question they had. You may want to press me on that, and I'll send the question on over to Jim. Are you ready? If we have that question? Okay. Within the Dead Sea Scrolls, are there any books you feel should have been in the Bible, should have been in the Protestant canon? Oy. Oy vey, they would say. You know, there is so much literature from this time period. We've talked about the Apocrypha, the Pseudepigrapha, this other literature that we're bumping into. The Dead Sea Scrolls have told us much more about what was in the Pseudepigrapha than we knew before. So, huge collections. I think that there are some great books. I think everybody ought to read them. I don't know if you know that in the 1840s, when Adventism was taking its root, you could hardly buy a Bible, a Protestant Bible, in the U.S. that did not have the Apocrypha in it. These people knew the Apocrypha. I think, whether it should be part of the Bible or not, I think we've cheated ourselves. There's so much helpful background, certainly for reading the New Testament. I think we are truly blindsided if when we try to understand the New Testament, we don't have some of what now is available to us in this intertestamental literature, like some of the Dead Sea Scrolls that were evidently read by New Testament writers. So I don't know if there's any. I've never thought that the rule of the community should be. That reminds me too much of the Academy rule book. So I'm not sure that I would want that to happen. But it's interesting. Think about it. Of that first list of the biblical books that show up at Qumran and how many copies, how many manuscripts there are, out of the first 7, 5 of them are the books of the Pentateuch, are the books Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. The books of Moses were somehow really important to this community. So rules for the community to live by is not a stretch when your favorite book is Deuteronomy. Well, okay, Psalms and then Deuteronomy. So I don't know that I would want that in the Bible. I think we have enough rules in the Bible already, so maybe not. Okay. You may want to press me on that one further too. I mean, there are some. Okay, here's what I think we ought to do. I think we ought to read them. And you can get them all. I'm going to watch my microphone as I come under this speaker. All of the Dead Sea Scrolls are here. You can read them all, or you can get collections of the Apocrypha or the Pseudepigrapha and read it. It's great reading, and there are some materials there that are very much like biblical. Which ones I would include, I don't know. From the Dead Sea Scrolls, does it give any light on the history of baptism? Baptism. I don't know the answer to this question. There certainly is the Jewish practice of ritual bath that's around at this time. We find the baths all over the place archaeologically. And most people would argue that somehow that practice influenced Christian baptism. How the Dead Sea Scrolls play into that, I don't know. I don't know. There are now digital resources with all of the Dead Sea Scroll materials on it, and it would be fun to trace the word. You could do that electronically quite easily. So, okay, that's an assignment for the next time I teach this class for one of my students. We'll report back. In many slides showing from the Dead Sea Scrolls, showing pictures from the Dead Sea Scrolls, It looks only a small fraction of remains. How can one reconstruct what they contain? Your slides show whole, complete text reconstructions. How is that possible? Very good question. Part of this is that if we find fragments of a manuscript, like Enoch, like First Enoch, which were found at Qumran, several copies, we already know Enoch from, not in the original language, but we already know Enoch from the pseudepigrapha. So you then start putting your pieces of your fragments, you put them out on a glass is what you do. And then you have the text, you reconstruct the Hebrew text of what you already have, and then you can see where these pieces go, and then you can start extrapolating how these might be the same and how it might be different. So it's a bit of an extended process. It is true, though, that we tend to use small amounts for reconstructing the whole. I think most of the time it's pretty reliable. Later discoveries can help us make corrections, but most of the time it's pretty good. The area where the scrolls were found is very inhospitable, without vegetation. What would the shepherd or sheep have to do there? What would you do with your animals? What would you do if you lived there? Actually, it is very dry, but it's not far to where it's very fertile. This is at the southern end of the Jordan Valley. You're not far away from extremely rich agricultural lands, all kinds of possibilities for date palms, for vineyards, for olive orchards, and so on. So it's not too problematic, and you have a lot of water that's coming over the escarpment from the land, from Israel Palestine to the west. So that usually, and shepherds would typically take their flocks quite a distance. And what you would do, of course, is move with the seasons. In the wintertime, especially when you get rain, you're going to get some greenery down lower, and that greenery is going to turn browner and browner as the summer comes on, so you just move up the hills further, and there are ways to that. Is it possible that the relatives of Jesus' family were Essenes, were part of this community, this part of Judaism? Judaism, I think you know, had several sects to it. The Sadducees, who were the wealthiest and the most conservative, they only had 5 books to their Bible, period. And that's the Pentateuch. And then you got the Zealots, who were busy trying to fight off the Romans. And then you have the Pharisees, and we tend to rag on the Pharisees a lot. Truth is, Pharisees were the most progressive group in Judaism. They looked for ways to observe and to respect Moses and the guidelines, while at the same time trying to make them work for them in their lives, hundreds of years removed from the time of Moses. Pharisees are the progressives. If there were an association of Adventist forums in the first century, it would have been started by the Pharisees. You may not be comfortable with that idea, but they're the progressive ones. They're looking for ways to live and be faithful at the same time. Now, the Essenes, of course, they're the ones who are pulling away from what they see as a corrupt priesthood. Who is in charge of the priesthood? Well, there were several groups, but the Sadducees in particular had a lot to do with temple function. So here is this group pulling away even from the conservatives, trying to get away into a life that they can live. Was anybody related to Jesus a part of this? It would be impossible to know, very unlikely. Jesus' family, if you trace his roots to the north, to Nazareth, that's quite a distance from south of Jerusalem, and a bit of a challenge to get there. I think if we were to argue for the New Testament characters connected with Qumran, it would be John the Baptist. This is the area in which John the Baptist lived and worked. This is the desert from which he came. Did Jesus, in his trip to the desert, spend any time at Qumran? That's an interesting question. I don't know. But John the Baptist is a person who many people feel you could connect with the Qumran community. Don't know. I'm not sure we could go anywhere with Jesus. Of course, if you have all of the popular options for who belong to Jesus' family, with all of the news in the last 2 or 3 years about marrying Mary Magdalene and all of those sorts of things, the circle would enlarge and you'd have more possibility. But I don't think so. I don't go there. You use the word inspiration when talking about the Dead Sea Scrolls that were not in the Bible. What would you say to someone who says a true Christian would not find divine inspiration in books that were not added to the Bible? We have a couple of challenges with this. One is that the process by which we have canon or Bible is an historical process, and it's locked into time. We can talk about when the Old Testament received the form in which we now have it. It's the end of the 1st century A.D. at the Council of Yamnia or Yavna. That's the first time we have the list that we currently treat as the Old Testament. That's historical, and it's historically anchored. It's true for Judaism. It's true for Protestant Christianity. That's where we've locked it in. Can we now, later, make an adjustment? Well, I guess we could, but all of a sudden the historical notion of what has been deemed Scripture, what has been deemed the books from which we hear the voice of God, all of a sudden that historical decision is relative, isn't tied up, and isn't tied anymore. What would we do, for instance, in New Testament scholarship, most people feel there were 4 letters to the Corinthians. How many do we have in the New Testament? We have 2. There's certainly at least one more because the books themselves talk about it. What would happen if an archaeologist were to come to report next time at the Association of Adventist Forum that she had excavated the 3rd book to the Corinthians? Would you accept it into your Bible? What if you could really prove that Paul wrote it? What if you could really prove that it came from the context that it claims? Would you put it into your Bible? See, that's the dilemma. So we've got these historical parameters in which we have to work. So I'm not sure that, at least I'm not sure that I'm comfortable, given the history of canon, to say that I'm going to add a bunch. But does that then mean that there isn't inspired material out there? That you don't hear, for instance, an inspired sermon? Not just inspiring, but inspired. Is it possible that you hear an inspired sermon? Most of the Bible, probably 95% of the Bible, was first of all spoken. Sometimes it took generations before it was ever written down. So if you heard something that you thought truly was God's voice, would it reduce its impact by saying it can't belong in the Bible? I don't think so. If we have some sense that God is still at work, I think we have a bit of open-endedness there. When did you say we need to be done? When do we need to be done? Okay, well, I've got about 4 or 5 more here, and then we'll see where we go. Might some of the scrolls found be simply people over-analyzing the books that they've already read, referring to writings that are not found in our modern Bible? And I think, if I understand this question, are we over-analyzing? Are we making too much of this material? That's not impossible. Some of you know that you can, when you see, well, there's a commentary on the Song of Songs, on the Song of Solomon. The Song of Solomon is how many chapters? 8. It's very short. It's not many pages. And there's a commentary that's this thick, published by Marvin Pope in the Anchor Bible series on the Song of Solomon. Is that being a little bit over-analytical? Maybe so. How much can you do with these few words? And this probably does happen. And one of the reasons it happens is because scholars, one of the things they do a lot is argue. And so if you want to make your point, you've got to look a little deeper. You've got to turn another leaf over. You've got to, scramble to the sources and so on. And so it's probably the case. But what I like is that when all is said and done and when the scholars have beaten on each other long enough, that something comes of that debate that we really can take confidence in, that we can really say, this has been hammered out. And that comes from overanalyzing. I'm happy, as you are, with the final results, but I'm also trained to do the hammering. So I've got to be on both sides of that. In any case, I am glad for this overanalyzing. Ultimately, what does it mean for us? And that's why I like the synthetic books, the books that bring it down. I would say that this book, if you're really interested in pursuing it, by James Vanderkam and Peter Flint, is one of those, it is still an academic book, but it's one of those books that's pulling together the best of all of this overanalyzing. So that's the kind of book that it is. Okay, has your study of the Dead Sea Scrolls had any impact or influence on your personal spiritual life? If yes, please identify the most important influences or impacts your study of the Dead Sea Scrolls have had. I would have to say that any literature that I study that is connected to biblical studies, I mean, that's my training, is biblical studies, that any literature connected to it, and I'm especially thinking of religious literature, especially ancient religious literature, affects me at all levels. What I often end up doing, because it's a kind of a mantra with me, I have three questions that I ask and that I ask my students to ask of a biblical passage. What did those words mean to the people who first heard them? And I've used the word heard, because that's how these things were first given. So what did these words mean to the people who first heard them? Secondly, what then do they mean to us today? And the then is important because it's not just an academic exercise to try to find out what the words meant, but then what do they mean? And then my third question is not an academic question. It's rather more of a holistic question. How am I moved by that? How am I changed? So what? What's the difference? So here are these texts. Here are these scrolls. They have a lot to do with understanding how people in Bible times understood things, how they lived. If I can get, and you've heard me say this before, those of you who went to the retreat, those of you who've been here before when I've been here before, that if I can somehow slip out of my shoes into an ancient person's sandals, I think I'm in a better position to hear what that prophet had to say. Notice what the Qumran community does. The Qumran community reads Habakkuk from the 7th century BC and says, Habakkuk is talking about the Romans, not the Babylonians, the Romans. The Romans are bothering us. Habakkuk is talking about us. I want to go past that. Well, Adventists do that. We read the Bible. The prophet is talking about us. I'd like to say first, let me find out what he was talking about to the people who first heard him. So, any of these scrolls and any of these texts which have to do with the biblical text drive me to those three questions. So I want to find out what these words meant to the people who first heard them in their context. Then I want to find out what they meant to me. And then I want to ask, so how do they affect me? How do they change me? And that third question takes me into spiritual. I mean, you can do the first two questions and just be purely academic about it. You can take a test. You can write quizzes. You can do all kinds of things academic with those first two questions. But the last question forces us to confront it at the level of our whole being. And that's where I put spirituality. So yes, the short answer, I just could have said yes, but no, okay. Given all the detailed rules identified in the community scroll, did the Qumran community have a large judicial system with many people observing and enforcing these rules? Or just overly observant neighbors. Um, it was never a large community. So I don't know how sophisticated it could have been. Now, they do talk about it a lot. And they talk about what it means, what your actions mean in terms of the community. So people are observing. But another thing, and people are observing and people are responding. But another thing to keep in mind is that as with biblical passages, we often have laws that set out the ideal. Whether those laws were ever really encountered in real life is a very good question. Let me give you an example. The, call it the sabbatical or the Jubilee year for agriculture. Every 7 years you're supposed to leave a field fallow and not grow anything in it. Did people observe that? We have no way to know. The notion of freeing slaves every 49th, on the Jubilee, on this Jubilee year, did that ever happen? Or was that just the ideal? I don't know. So part of this we could never test. But somebody must have been looking over somebody's shoulder, seeing what mischief they were up to, I guess. I think it would be interesting, too, to find a list that had been preserved among the scrolls. Samuel and Leah were both laughing too loud in services and were given 10 days penance. What do you think? Wouldn't that have been nice? Wouldn't we? I mean, that would be, we could test it. Otherwise, we just have the rules and what you're supposed to do. I saw somebody back here laughing. That'll be 10 days for you. The preference of the book of Deuteronomy in the scrolls does or does not also indicate the author of Deuteronomy other than Moses? Good question. My sense is that, and I think this is true for Qumran as well as Jerusalem, I think in general, Judaism at the time of Jesus, and the first couple centuries before Jesus, that respect for Moses is really the highest form of respect. If you study the history of the origin of the canon, as best we can know it, the first listing of the books of what could be called a Bible comes from about 400 BC. And that Bible has the books of Moses. Oh, yes, there were others, but the books of Moses. When you get to 200 BC, the prophets are now included in what we could call Bible. So now it's Moses and the prophets. By the time you get to 100 AD, you've got Moses, the prophets, and the writings. Moses is always there. The authority of Moses is the highest kind of authority there is. Now, the question might be tied to this too. If you've got scribes writing away, and there are these different scribal traditions, aren't they being a little loose with Moses? I mean, okay. If Moses is so respected, why would you develop a kind of a text tradition that would carry you a little bit past Moses? So you've got that kind of an issue. I don't have an answer for that, except to say that my sense is, especially at Qumran, a tremendous dedication to the authority of Scripture, primarily Moses. Primarily Moses. Did Moses write all of the Pentateuch? No. He certainly didn't write his own obituary at the end of the book of Deuteronomy. Most people would argue that there's the theology, the impulse, the strength of Moses that comes in these books we call the books of Moses. But there's been a lot of development over time. So we're going to have to be flexible with that, as we would with Scripture, as we would with Ellen White, and remember that there are just all kinds of things going on as this material somehow under God's guidance come to us. Okay, other questions. I've made it faithfully. Well, I don't know if I've answered your questions exactly, but I've made it through that list. Are there other questions that we might
And
want to pursue.
if you have a question, come to a microphone so we can get it recorded, all right? And there are microphones set up on either place. First come, first served. No extra charge if you're second. Come on to a microphone, okay? Either that one or this one, okay? Or you can use this one.
Thank you.
All right?
We were told that the book of Isaiah with the Dead Sea Scrolls is about the same as what we have today. There are only very minor differences. Now, does your research support this?
Actually, I think one of the reasons for Isaiah's popularity, let me put it another way. The fact that Isaiah was so popular demonstrates the regard for Isaiah. And yes, the text of Isaiah seems to be, in fact, it's one of those books that seems to be even more consistent than some in terms of one edition to the next. There are what are called variants. They're called patterns of variants. When a scribe or a scribal family is copying a text, often those sorts of variants just kind of find their way in it. But if you want to find the basic book of Isaiah, the scrolls are extremely helpful. Yes.
Thank you.
Yes. And that brings us, and thank you for the question on another count too, brings us to the whole issue of a science we call textual criticism, textual analysis. And that is to bring all the manuscripts you have together, put them out on a table from oldest to youngest, from the original language to other languages, put them all out there, and then your goal is to try to find out what the original Isaiah really had. The Qumran materials are often cited in textual criticism for giving us as close as we can get to Isaiah. They are very helpful. And again, Isaiah seems to be fairly consistent. Isaiah seems to be, in terms of the text and of the preservation of the text through time, seems to be pretty good. That doesn't go back to the issues of whether Isaiah wrote the whole book. But people didn't ask that question. Some of us would rather not ask that question today. But in any case, as far as the text is concerned, Isaiah has a great textual tradition. Yeah.
Okay, Eldon?
Dr. Clark, you have done an excellent job in helping us to see a little clearer the total story of what the Dead Sea Scrolls have done and how they have contributed to our study of the Bible. The last time you were here with, I believe, Dr. Herr, and you were talking about archaeology and diggings and so forth. Have there been just a little different aspect? Have there been any diggings that have been very unusual, that have come of late, that are related to the Bible in any way?
Lots of excavations going on related to the Bible in a number of different ways. I'm just thinking of a couple things that come quickly to mind that might be kind of spectacular finds, kind of important finds. Sometimes the spectacular finds are very small, and one of them is a small piece of pottery with what is called an abecedary. In other words, it's an alphabet. An abecedary is an A, B, C, D, E, F, G, only it's Aleph, Beit, Gimel, Dalet, Hey, Vav, Zayin, etc., which was discovered at, the name of the site it's in southern Israel. Zayit, Tel Zayit, I think is the name of it, by a colleague. And this, it looks like, is the earliest of, or at least one of the earliest expressions of Hebrew. And if we think about our Bible, we're dependent on Hebrew. And this is probably one of the earliest, certainly one of the earliest found inscriptions. And it is, of all things, a list of the alphabet. I mean, it'd be nice if it were God said to you to do something, but okay, we will work with what we have. But I think that really was important. There's another set of discoveries that I don't think have been as helpful, but they've garnered more news. And that is all of the flap, I'll use that word, about some of the ossuaries that were tied to Jesus and his family. The ossuary that made its way to, actually it was to Canada, and I was at the conference where that came, the bone box. These are these limestone bone boxes in which bones secondarily were put, and there was the name of let's see, I think it had Jesus, well, it was Judas, son of Joseph, brother of Jesus, I think is what the thing said. And that was really big because that was family stuff with Jesus. Turns out it simply wasn't so. So that's news, but I don't know that it's helpful news. The news about the discovery of more of these bone boxes, these stone ossuaries, in Jerusalem at the Talpiot plot, Talpiot tombs, in which people are connecting Jesus with Mary of Magdalene and Mary's family and so on. That's interesting, but don't go there. It's not as helpful. Other things that are helpful, what I think, now this may be more me than the general public, but what I find to be exciting on a continuing basis is the discovery of, and ways of discovering how people actually lived in Bible times. And that just keeps on going. There are all kinds of things. And then I was thinking of a piece I just saw. What was it? This is from New Testament times, actually a little bit post-New Testament. A piece that just came out, what's today, the 14th? Came out the 11th of March, about a Roman aqueduct system that ran for about, if you put them all together, a total of about 100 kilometers underground. People, I'm thinking as someone who lives in Southern California now and thinks about water, this is a major activity, and that's something about what people valued. Let me see if there was another thing that was on the tip of my tongue that came out. Again, this is Roman times, but you may be interested, you may not. The gladiators. We hear about the gladiators. We certainly hear about that in the Roman times of the late New Testament and into the 1st and 2nd centuries AD. Did you know that gladiators, this has been discovered through analysis of burials and so on, that at least the gladiators buried at Ephesus in southwest Turkey, what do you suspect they fed the gladiators? They were vegetarian. Now, I don't know how you determine these things. We're going to have to depend on people who do a bit of overanalyzing. But in any case, they were vegetarian. And, these gladiators are property. They're wealth. And you don't want to lose them. So you make them strong, and then you feed them something to give them a little bit of fat on the outside so that the muscle itself isn't damaged as much. So what happens, somebody pressed the point in this article that I read, what happens if it's vegetarian, at least the vegetarian, the way it was detected in these bones, what happens about calcium? Well, evidently the lack of calcium was a problem, so what did they do? Well, they ate one of two things. You had two choices if you wanted to build your calcium. Some of you may be thinking about this too. One of them was to eat ashes right out of the fire pit, lots of calcium there, or charcoal. Evidently these gladiators, I don't know why I'm off on gladiators, but anyway, evidently these gladiators were vegetarian, but they made sure to have their quotient of ash to be sure that they had strong bones. It was Wonder Bread when I was growing up, but no, it's ash here. So, that's kind of an odd thing, but it really is important to me to just what we continue to keep discovering about how people lived. Now, it's exciting, of course, to find the Dead Sea Scrolls. August of 1947 was a very good year. It was when the Dead Sea Scrolls were found, but I was born that month too. So I've always liked the Dead Sea Scrolls. I've always had a soft spot in my heart for them. But if you can find if you can find text, you know that in ancient times there weren't a lot of texts. These people mostly lived as oral, in an oral society. So when you find text, it's like finding an explanation tag. This object, which you don't seem to figure out how to use, this is what it was. It's nice to have those instructions. Texts give us that. So we do keep finding texts. I'm still playing off of your question here. So when we can find texts that help us, but I'm as interested or more interested in what can tell me how people in the time of Isaiah lived, how people in the time of Moses lived, how people in the time of Paul lived, so that I can enter their world and I think then read the Bible with greater information, with greater background. So.
Any question over here?
I'm struggling to summarize in my mind the answer to your question of your talk about any Adventist thing coming out of Qumran. I'm wondering if you could quickly summarize your answer to your own question.
Good. You frame these questions for odd reasons. I think this one came it was really late at night, and Jim Kotz was on my case to get a title down here. But actually, can any Adventist thing come out of Qumran? What I think I would do to summarize a response to that is that I don't know, Adventism has absolutely no historical traces back to Qumran. It's not there. Adventism, at least historically, was born before we knew about the Dead Sea Scrolls, so we can't do that. But here's where I would go with that. I would say that the time frame, the world, the ethos, the milieu, the setting, the environment of the rise of the Qumran community and the rise of Adventism is very similar in terms of apocalyptic expectation, in terms of an awakening. I would argue that the sensed need to pull away from the corrupting influences around us is similar. So I would argue on the basis of those kinds of similarities. I would also argue that the basic, it's the blood that flows through Adventist veins to place on the future, on God's future, hope. That is precisely the blood that flowed through the veins of the inhabitants of Qumran. Things were not good. Things were not good. And here comes, from the Bible, no less, and this is going to be a similarity too, from the Bible, here's Habakkuk. And who's he talking about? Well, the people at Qumran weren't interested in Habakkuk in his time. They were interested in what God had to say to them. And who were the Katim? They weren't the Babylonians. That's what Habakkuk was talking about. They were the Romans. Habakkuk is talking about us. Adventists do that too. So I think that the sense of the milieu, the sense of apocalyptic expectation, the way we read and interpret and appreciate the Bible. I would even argue that Adventists, at least early on, were really quite interested in rules. I don't know if you want to go there or not, but if you look at the art, the early art, you're gonna have Beatrice Mejia Krumbein here next month. Terrific. She has a way of capturing art and is such a powerful artist that you really need to come and listen to her. And ask her about the paintings that she's done on women. She may talk about it anyway. The 28 paintings for 28 days. Ask her about the women ones. She has an amazing collection of paintings that she's done. And I was going where with that? Yes, Adventist art, early Adventist art. What is in early Adventist art at the very center of what we used for advertising meetings and what we used to illustrate meetings and so on? It was the 10 Commandments. That shifted in the 80s and 90s. So that the art that was used for evangelistic series, for illustrating in books, that central focus on the law shifted to the cross. Now, you and I, we all know that shift hasn't completely taken place. I don't have to talk about the last 25, 30 years in Adventism very long without bumping into that. So even the art illustrates that the notion of rules was central, at least at the beginning. So it's those kinds of things that I'm thinking about.
Other questions? Come on over.
I have two more questions. You have any idea why the book of Esther was not available in their library? Number two, Qumran society existed quite a bit beyond the time Jesus was here on earth. Were they totally isolated from his messages?
Let me come to the second question first, and I'll remember Esther as the first one. I mean, in a sense, the second one is easier to answer because I don't know. And I don't know how, I'm not sure of what kind of evidence there would be to illustrate it. It would be, it is true that Qumran is extremely isolated. However, if Josephus is correct, Qumran is not the only community of Essenes. So you can say that it was Essenes who lived at Qumran, but if you were Essene, you didn't have to live at Qumran. You could live in there were other clusters. It just seems really hard to believe that the events surrounding the life and death of Jesus went unnoticed. So I can't imagine that somehow nothing rubbed off. However, Jesus was aligned with which of the groups more closely than the others? Was he aligned with the Sadducees? No. Was he aligned with the Zealots, who said, take up the sword? No. Was he aligned with the Essenes in their ultra-exclusive and conservative and conservative nature? Okay, who does that leave? The Pharisees. Now, were the Pharisees appreciated by the members of the Essene community? No. So, there are lots of reasons, not just that we don't know, but there are lots of reasons to assume that the Essenes didn't want to be influenced too much by that. But again, I can't imagine that in a country that small and with so much happening in Jerusalem and with Essene communities in different places, not a lot of them, but around in different places, that somehow the influence of Jesus would be there. Does it come up in the writings? I don't know. There are people who argue, and you'll find a chapter or a section in this book by Vander Kam and Flint. There are people who argue that the New Testament philosophy and some theological notions from the New Testament actually do end up in the Qumran community and their library after the death of Jesus. There are people who argue that. I think it is totally speculation. I just can't go with those arguments. So I don't think so. I don't think there's any way to demonstrate it, but I can't imagine none, but I can imagine a lot. I have answered your question with many, many possibilities, haven't I? You are not satisfied with that answer, are you? Okay, we can talk more later. He may be back up at the microphone again. Okay, Esther. Esther is an intriguing book. I think most of you know that Esther does not mention the name of God. That's a problem. Esther also has in it a Jewish festival, Purim, which is not in the books of Moses. That's a problem. Esther also has a lot of parties. There's a word in Hebrew, and I think it shows up about 40 sometimes, 45 times, something like that. And it's a noun, and it's for a drinking party. You don't want to push teetotalism too far back into the Old Testament because that's not an agenda there. In Esther, fully half of the times that noun is used for a drinking party are in the book of Esther. So some people have said this is just too happy of a book and cannot be part of our canon. What saved Esther was the fact that when it's written, this festival is going on, and this festival was an extremely important festival of resisting evil, overcoming evil, and that evil will get its just desserts. So, I mean, there's a lot to that. There's an argument, though. There's a fairly significant debate in the literature about the Qumran community and whether or not it just accidentally didn't show up, that's why it's not there, or whether intentionally it was left out. I tend to favor the latter. I think that it was intentionally left out for the reasons that I've cited, especially a conservative community, especially a community for whom which books were the most popular? The books of Moses. And Purim is not there. So I would argue that this was intentionally left out, and it was for reasons that we just don't have the Mosaic connection, the authority of Moses behind it, as well as these other things. And the fact that it doesn't mention God, that's a problem too. Okay?
Hey, other questions? Have you exhausted the speaker or exhausted the audience? Or both? It looks as if we've had a good time, and we're going to say thank you to our speaker, all right? Thanks, Doug. I want to remind you of your next appointment back here. What's the date? The next appointment? April 11. Okay. What's the topic? Art and spirituality. And the presenter is a world traveler, born and raised in Colombia, living in Mexico, Germany, and in the U.S. And I will tell you that what she will have to present will get your attention. Let's stand as we're dismissed. We thank you again, Lord, for the privilege we have of being participant in a meeting like this, where we can have our understanding expanded as to our history, the times of the past. We ask that you'll help us to see ways in which you make application into our own spiritual growth. Be with us now as we travel to our homes, we ask, and we thank you in Jesus' name. Amen. God's blessing. See you later. Okay?